Well, hello and welcome to More to the Story with Molly White. I'm so glad you joined me again today. And this is part two of our part one series on men and abortion and the research that's gone into that study on how abortion impacts men. So before I reintroduce our guest, I want to welcome my awesome and wonderful co-host, Mary Browning. Hey, Mary.
Hi, Molly. I'm so glad that we are continuing to this in this part two. And I want to remind our listeners that if you have abortion in your past or know someone who does or may have helped with one, that is said today may trigger an emotion. And if that happens, we just consider that an invitation to another level of healing. And you can call the H3 helpline at 866-721-7881, and somebody there can help you with healing resources.
Thank you, Mary. Now, we had Dr. Jeff Pauls on our first show in this two-part series, and he is a researcher with the Vitae.
Vitae.
That's a tricky spelling there. The Vitae Foundation, and his work has helped establish Vitae as a prominent research authority on pro-life messaging. And our first show with Dr. Jeff Pauls, he really explained about the method of research, how they got people to sit in on this research about how abortion impacts men, and then the process of helping, how to help men go back there and tap into those memories and tap into those feelings when they were faced with the unexpected pregnancy and the outcome of that pregnancy. So now we're going to jump in and have Jeff kind of tell us about some of the 5 surprises that he found after he did this research on this group of men. So welcome back, Jeff. Thank you for joining us again, and we look forward to continuing our conversation.
Thank you again for having me, and thank you for sticking with me through the description of the research for part one. If you're back for part two, excited to share some of the actual results from the men's study.
Good. We're looking forward to it too, because we just found it fascinating of the right brain strategy that you use to interview these men who've experienced abortion or had never experienced an unplanned pregnancy. That was fascinating. So now let's just kind of go into what was some of the most surprising findings that you found after this.
Yeah, well, the first one is it kind of interesting that it's probably not surprising that we found the 2 most prevalent emotional responses to an unexpected pregnancy were fear and shock. Those 2 probably are not surprising to anybody, but the next 2, and these were very prevalent through all of our, I shouldn't say all of our interviews, but most of our interviews, the next 2 most prominent, deep, recurring emotional responses were excitement and happiness. And this is from men who, some of them had even, a lot of them had even said, I'll support you whatever you choose, even though they were happy. This is the crazy thing, that they didn't feel like they could share that because, again, they've been trained, they've been conditioned by the culture, by the abortion industry and we look at this and we see like, well, there's an evil genius here in helping men pull away and not share, their strongest responses. They don't even share that they're scared or they're shocked, or they probably more often that they do share that they're shocked, but to some degree that they are scared, but they definitely, there's times where they don't share that they're actually happy or excited because they're worried that they're gonna, force the woman into making a decision or something like that. And so they've kind of, again, been conditioned to not share those really important emotions and that she really wants to hear. We say a lot of times, if she didn't really want to know what he was thinking, she would have just gone to get the abortion without even telling him, because she doesn't need him to do that. And so, that was pretty surprising, I think. Yeah. So I'll roll through them. And then if you have questions, feel free to stop me, if you have a question or a comment about one of the surprises, but I'll keep sharing
Yeah.
unless you've got.
And isn't that, though, typical of the enemy and typical of what we call social brainwashing? I think the abortion industry and whoever their strategists were at the time, they may have known are really focused on keeping the men out of the equation because I think instinctively or intuitively, they knew that men are protectors or providers. They're going to want to protect their babies. They want to protect the mother of their children. So they really had to work hard to condition men to think that they had no choice because it was the woman that was carrying the baby, but that baby was his, So so that's a part that, they've really put a lot of effort into. And I think the second part of that, because as women, like you said, we want to know how they feel. If they're excited, we're going to be excited more than likely.
Yes.
It's going to impact our insecurities because we feel afraid too and we feel uncertain. Can we do this by ourselves? And so we really need men to step up and say, hey, I'm excited about this pregnancy. I can't believe I'm going to be a father. What can we do to work this out? So that's one area that I felt the abortion industry really went after, and also to keep men from being with the mother of their child in the abortion clinic, because I think they knew that once that the man could influence her and say, let's not
Yes.
do that. They're not giving you the correct information, or they might ask too many questions. And so keeping the man separated from the mother at the abortion clinics is another strategy that the industry uses to make
Yeah.
sure that they get that abortion performed.
That is so right on. In fact, in talking with Abby Johnson, she has told stories, all with her work and then there were none working with former abortion industry workers. Tells the story that multiple places, multiple locations across the country, multiple workers have told her that those facilities will actually crank up the heat in the waiting room where the men are waiting to try to get them to leave and go outside to their car because it's just so uncomfortable, and they'll, it's, I mean, and that's why. That's
Because if they
exactly
hear,
why.
even if they hear women crying or
Yeah.
screaming in the
Yeah.
lobby,
There's
then
that response.
their instincts are gonna want to get up and do something to protect. So
I
Yeah.
know
anyway,
just for me, if the news of our unexpected pregnancy had been received differently, I I would have been excited too. I mean, I'm just thinking about if the mother and the father are excited about the new baby, then there's kind of no other thing to think about except how we're going to manage this. And so
Yeah.
I just want to chime in there,
It's
just
so
on the other
important
side of it.
because that it's that miscommunication, this it's like that. And again, that's why the pregnancy centers are so important, is, especially if they can get the man to come to the appointment, and they have a fatherhood program, that they have a mentor that can work with the man, and that he can see the ultrasound or hear the heartbeat. We'll talk about that. I'm giving away one of the surprises here, but how powerful it is for a man to see that, and but to have that conversation and to help them have that conversation, because again, the abortion industry doesn't want them to communicate about this. They don't want, they know that the man has, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to do this study, is to find out, okay, how can we help men to kind of regain that voice for life? How can we help them regain and step up into what we thought is a natural inclination towards providing and protecting. And we did find that that is a natural inclination. Now, men also will talk about the fact that so many of them were raised without fathers, and so they saw their mothers or their grandmothers or their aunts stepping in to fill that void. So they believe that women can also provide and protect, but that's because they didn't
There's
have
a
a
void.
father, and
Hmm.
but they do still acknowledge that all men have that responsibility, and just some of them again abdicate that responsibility and leave it, so that some women have to step in to do that. So they will acknowledge that women can also do that. But anyway, that's just something, but it's there, and we
Just
found
kind of
that
like
in this study.
what I mentioned in the first part of the series is that there's only two kinds of people. God created man. He created him a certain way, certain functions, certain strengths, and certain weaknesses. And he created women a certain way, certain functions, certain strengths, and certain weaknesses. But he created them so that we could both join together and become one. So, but the way we were created, this is how we react, or what our role is for like a provider, protector for a man. It may not always come out that way and may get deeply damaged, but that's the way we were created. Or so anyway, so let's just go back. So we know that the first reaction, or the most common reaction, was fear. And I think that's probably pretty common in women too. If it's unplanned and unexpected, like, oh my goodness, how am I going to tell my parents, or I am in school or work or whatever. So I think that's probably common across the board. And then shock, that's probably a common reaction too. But it seems to me, if you're having sex, the likelihood of getting pregnant is probably pretty high, even if you're trying to keep from getting pregnant. And then the excitement and happiness. And you said, men were afraid to express how they felt, which is so important because women need to know how they feel. And so what would be, so is that like 4? Is that the four out of the 5?
Unfortunately, that was just one.
Boy, okay. So,
So
that's just one. Okay, go
that
ahead
was
and keep
just one. I can kind of check off the other ones, and then if there's any of them that you want to ask questions about, or whatever, I'm happy to do it however you would prefer. But
Well, go ahead and let's keep going.
okay, all right. So number 2 is, obviously they respond emotionally in these different ways, but then what's was surprising is how they chose to respond to because we think, I think most people think of just like these deadbeat dads or these guys that are really pushing for abortion. And that's like the narrative that we hear, mostly. But by far, the most common response for a man in that situation was taking responsibility. He wanted to take responsibility. Now, sometimes he didn't know how, and he didn't actually do it, but he knew most of these men said that it was the opportunity for them to to become responsible, to be, and so we've developed this into like messaging where this is an opportunity to kind of call him to step up into what he was made to be. And it might have not been the way he thought it would have that he would become a man. Like a lot of people think, well, it's go to high school, get a job. That's the way. Go to college, graduate, get, that sort of get a career, maybe go to the military, that's how you become a man. Well, for this, in this situation, it wouldn't have been the way you thought it would be, but this is how you become a man. This is becoming a man is taking responsibility. And he sees that, like that was the most common response. Like, well, he's kind of like, well, I didn't plan on this, but this is what I got to do now. I got to do what I got to do, and to step up. And that's what he kept talking about that. Now, unfortunately, there is a contingent, or some men would talk about, well, I needed to take responsibility. And for us in this situation, because of financial situation, maturity, self and bad relationship, the responsible thing to do was to push for an abortion. But that's a subtle, important understanding that he still was trying to take responsibility. And so, it's just something that we have to learn as a pro-life movement to help him take responsibility in the like, authentic way, or a life affirming way, because sometimes, and again, what we hear from these interviews, it's not always, like true, or it's not necessarily like factual. It's what they're feeling. And so that's important for us to know, so that we can message to them where they're at and move them, further to a more pro-life perspective. But anyway, I think it still is a really positive surprise that they do want to choose responsibility and to take responsibility at that point.
Jeff, I know one of the things that I've heard in this arena is like, well, I'm not ready to be a parent. I'm not ready to be a father. And I heard someone say one time, well, you are.
Already are. Yeah.
You already are. So what kind of father? So the question isn't, are you going to be a father? It's what kind of father you're going to be. And as you were saying that, it just reminded me of that, because I'd never thought of it from that perspective. I think it's powerful. It's more about calling forth the intended identity rather than letting an excuse or a reason not to step into that responsibility.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Yeah.
but not what your research showed. I was just thinking about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Number 3, at what point? So we talked a lot about the rights of the child as opposed to the, the mom and the dad, the father and the mother. At what point should the child not be aborted? Like, because a lot of them, again, we're interviewing the movable middle, so they think that various times in the pregnancy it's okay to have an abortion, and so we kind of try to define, well, when is that, for most of them. And the very interesting thing is for men, there's very much an aspect of, and we heard this over and over and over again, well, when there's a heartbeat, like that kind of should define when the, child is alive or not. They have no clue that a heart starts beating at 14 days, 15 days, 16 days, and that then it can be detected, 2 weeks after that. So they think that it's, well into the fifth, sixth month or something. They just don't have any idea about, gestational, development and that sort of thing. But I think it still is, it's really powerful to know that that the heartbeat for some reason for men especially is something that is kind of, and again, if we can connect that to how early that is in the pregnancy. I mean, first of all, and again, I am all about the, abortion is never okay at any, from the moment of conception, we have a new human being, and I mean, we know that in the pro-life movement, but and all have in the history of science, we've known that, as well. But for them to know that that happens so early could be a game changer to understand, like, well, most abortions happen well after, the heartbeat, and so they may not
Hearts,
know that.
yeah, the heart's beating normally before we even know we're pregnant, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, a
Mhm.
lot of times,
Before
right?
we even
Yeah.
realize that we're pregnant. Well, that's
Yeah.
very interesting. Okay, so at that point, then they're gonna feel very strongly that that child should not be aborted. And so when they find out that the heart's already beating, the baby's already growing, then what kind of impact does that have on them?
Yeah, and that's, I think, the other thing I started to talk about earlier is that, and we know this from our work with pregnancy centers, that Vitae does a lot of digital marketing, and we beta test all of our messages that come from the research with pregnancy centers, and then we test those in different markets around the country to see where, if they're effective and that sort of thing. And so working with some of the centers, there was one group of centers in Colorado and another group of centers in Arizona, two separate groups, but multiple locations. If they have a man that comes in with the woman and they go through their fatherhood program and they see the ultrasound or hear the heartbeat, 95% of them in the one group chose life or changed their mind or pushed for having the child. 98% in the other group, and I can't remember which one is which now, but Colorado, Arizona, and but I mean, that's even more than what we found with women when we've done the statistical surveys of like what percentage changed their mind or decided to carry to term once they saw an ultrasound, once they saw their baby on an ultrasound. And I think it has something to do with the visual nature of men, when they see that or even hear that heartbeat. And I've told this story before too. I know I'm the same way. Like when I went in for when we had our first child, and I heard that fast, strong heartbeat on the monitor. I mean, at that point, I knew. Like, I mean, I knew everything had changed. I knew I was a father, and it didn't matter, And so I don't know. I mean, I kind of, I personally kind of back up the what we found from the data in our research. And so anyway, yeah, that was something
Good.
very interesting.
Beautiful.
Well,
All
okay,
right.
so number four is there were three differences between women and men in terms of how they respond to an unexpected pregnancy or abortion. And so this was something like we're getting to the heart of what said. There's only two types of people in the world, right, Molly? So with men, and we'll focus just kind of on the men here. Well, I have to compare it to the women, but the most important reason over and over and over and over again that men said that the reason why they were scared, it was overwhelmingly finances, financial issues. They were worried about how to provide for the family, how to provide for this child, not being ready to be able to provide financially. we have not heard that really with women in the past, that that was overwhelmingly the number one. That a lot of times that will be something they've talked about, but for men, so again, that's just important to know when you're counseling, a man like in a fatherhood program at a pregnancy center or something like that, or even talking with them, that's going to be priority number one, for them most often. The second difference was adoption. In the past, we've seen the difficulty that a lot of women have in considering adoption as an alternative because it feels almost like a double death to herself. And now I'm going back into some of the early studies where women see this unexpected pregnancy like it's going to result in a death of some sort. It's either going to result in like her death to her identity and her pre-pregnant self, and that's a very powerful death that she's facing, or it's going to be the actual death of the child, which a lot of times she has not seen, felt, heard, and so, all of a sudden, that becomes a much harder decision, emotionally when you compare those two things. And then you have the idea of adoption in our past studies where that was seen almost as a double death, where she still has to kind of give up her pre-pregnancy identity. So but yet then she's, quote, giving away the child. And so she's still suffering the death of motherhood at that point. And so, and again, there's some wonderful things that we have related to promoting and helping the idea of adoption, because it is, a wonderful thing, but you have to acknowledge what she's going through and what she's feeling, related to that. And yet for men, they don't, obviously, again, we're made different. They're not carrying the child. And so they almost universally talk about the good of adoption. They don't see any real negatives. And so again, in terms of messaging, men are much more open to that. Like, well, why not? It seems like a win-win and so it's just kind of more of a logical thing that they see. And then the final three differences that between men and women would be how they see the mistake. And so men see the mistake as, well, either didn't, I didn't use, we had sex and we didn't, use protection. And I made a bad decision or a lustful decision or whatever. And then, that this resulted, and so he sees that as the mistake, that he wasn't properly careful or his decision making or whatever. And then he's like, okay, at this point now, whether this ends in abortion or ends in a child, like I have to be okay with either one. I already made my choice, and the mistake was at the beginning. Whereas women will see, what we've seen in the past is more about it's the pregnancy, it's the unexpected pregnancy itself, not necessarily. It's like, so that's the decision that still has to be made. That's the mistake, and so that's what she has to like hide, or she's ashamed of. It's the actual, and yeah, maybe tied up a little bit into like unprotected sex or whatever. But for her, it's, okay, it would have been all fine and good if I just hadn't gotten pregnant. Being pregnant when I'm
Is
not
the
ready
mistake.
for it is the mistake. So that's a big, big psychological difference between
And
that.
very interesting. Very interesting. And I can see how that plays out between men and women. But I'm really surprised about the adoption part, and I'm pleased about that. And I think we really need to work on that messaging, of how men are more prone and more willing to place their child up for adoption than women are. And I don't know, Mary's been real involved with some third option adoption organization, but I don't know, Mary, if you knew that about the men.
I did not know that about the men, but I do find it fascinating. Particularly, I've mentioned this before, but years ago, I was asked by some high school nurses to come in and talk to some high school students because they had a number of them getting pregnant. And they said whether they could carry the baby, whether they weren't even cared for well, some of them themselves. But it was okay if they kept the baby, even they really had no way of providing. It was okay if they had an abortion, but it was completely unacceptable culturally for them to make the baby available for adoption. And so I'm looking at this thinking for the fathers, they're thinking, oh yes, that's a sensible solution. But because I think the pregnancy is the enemy, or from the woman's perspective, the pregnancy is the enemy. So we need to get rid of the enemy, so to speak. And that's what solves her problem. Nobody has to know she is pregnant or was pregnant. And where socially it's acceptable to have an abortion or to keep your baby, whether you can take care of your baby or not. But it wasn't acceptable. And I think that there may be some truth to that, which is why we are promoting in the third option coalition, we're promoting adoption and talking about the positives and the differences of what it used to be and what it is today, so that we're educating on adoption. So that's really good to know. Thank you, Jeff, for this research.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. There's one more here if we've got
Okay.
time.
Yes.
So, and this one I love because it's about fatherhood, and I touched on this just briefly earlier about how excited I was to become a father. And again, it's different when you're hoping for a child and you're expecting, you're trying and everything. And so all of these that we're talking about have all been, they're all unexpected pregnancies, so that's why some of this is really startling and surprising, I think, to have a man that is willing to step up and take responsibility, even though he's shocked and scared and, it's unexpected, like that's just, pretty powerful and pretty surprising. So anyway, and a lot of them had even well, I shouldn't say a lot. Some of them had abortions in their past. They had either pushed for it, or it was a situation where the woman just chose it. He had said, "I'll support you whatever you choose." So that kind of, again, subtly allowed her to, or kind of encourage her to have the abortion. And he knew, sometimes they even know that some, for the most part, they think that it is supportive, but there are some of them that are a little bit more savvy that can kind of even understand, like, well, if I say this, it's probably more likely she'll have an abortion because she knows, because I'm not supporting her. And if they don't want her to have the child, then sometimes they'll say that and say, like, I think this is maybe the best way for me. And some of them are just I have to say it, cowards. They'll say that because they don't want to have it on their conscience. They don't want to have been the one that said, I think, like, well, she did it. I have no, I hate to say that, but we did run
There's
across
no
that,
blood on
to a
my
certain
hands.
extent.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it.
I
But
didn't
there
make
But
that
really
decision.
is.
yes. But in general, what the question is, how do men feel about fatherhood, like fatherhood as a whole, including the men who unfortunately, tragically, had pushed to have an abortion previously. So even those men, almost to a man, very strong finding in this study, men look at fatherhood as a whole very, very positively. Even men who have pushed for abortion want to be a father someday, or talk about how important it is that that children have a father. And part of this comes to something that would not be a surprise, is that almost half of the men that we interviewed had been brought up without fathers. They either had completely absent fathers, or they had fathers that were in and out, or not involved at all, or emotionally distant or whatever. But a lot of them that were just weren't there, that were just didn't even know their father. But the neat thing is just how universal, how much a universal good fatherhood was for these men. And these are men that are really, some of them are just broken, and yet they'll talk about things. And I'd love to share just a couple of the words that they even use, because it's amazing. And these are words that I've used, but I mean, remember, think about these men and who they are. I mean, a lot of them, we had several men that had pushed for abortions, and because of the circumstances of life, had never had another child, and they regret it, and they're wondering, will I ever have, I might have aborted, I might have pushed to have the one chance that I had to be a father, and it hurts them, but listen to some of these words that these guys use. And again, remember, we did have those 3 segments, so we did have some men that were like, pretty much at the beginning excited, and like, and pushed the woman to have the child, or like extended. But again, that was only 1/3, so, and even that wasn't even 1/3, because it was part of one of the 3 groups. So, but here's some of the words that they said: joy, legacy, purpose, instilling good, pride, showing love and affection, enjoyment in watching kids grow, passing on positives, prioritizing kids over a job. My child is the most important thing in my life. Unconditional love between a father and a child. Children are something to live for. Lasting impact. Being a father makes life more beautiful. And so just, and these are guys that are not, these are not pro-life guys. These are a lot of them are rough and tumble and are broken. And yet almost to a man, they talk about they describe fatherhood, as a great good. So
It's amazing. And I've spent a lot of time researching and reading the Bible. And if you recall, when someone addresses, let's say, a man, you're the son of so and so, you're the son of so and so. It's always the son of the father,
yeah,
or the father, this is my son or my daughter. But it always reflects the son of, and they mention the father's name and never really mention the mother's name. And so to me, it just shows the kind of headship. And for me, and what the scriptures I've read and studied, and some of the teachings I've participated in, that really men carry life in their loins, and it's the seed of man that brings forth life, and the vessel is the mother, and of course connecting with that seed. So I can see through biblical eyes how men can feel this way, but in cultural eyes, you don't always see this, and understand it. So I'm so happy that you brought that and said those incredible words. I tried to write down as many as I could because I felt they were fascinating. And I've experienced a lot of this, within my own family. I didn't understand it, but I felt it in my,
yeah,
being raised. My parents were married almost 75 years before my dad passed away. So, I saw that we were the most important things and that he got great joy out of us. And then you could especially see it again when you bring in grandchildren. Then you could really see the joy that children brought to him, for me, my father. So I can see these things, but I never really saw them in this kind of language that you express that they said to you. So that all being said, I'm just curious about how that abortion impacted them.
yeah. That well, and I, I answer that, but I do want to just mention how beautiful I think it is what you said, and it really reflects the fact that the research that we do is completely complementary and intertwined with biblical truth because it represents the truth. I mean, God. If we're doing it right, and we're what we're going to find is, if we're approaching this in a really good, rigorous, using a good methodology, it's going to be hard sometimes. But what we find is going to back up what's in the Bible and what God teaches, because it's truth. It's truth, and so it makes total sense to us to see like these men saying this, even though it's a surprise, because like you said, we don't see this often sometimes in the culture, or it's hidden because the media doesn't like to talk about, or the other side doesn't like to talk about the goodness that is there, that's kind of naturally there. And unfortunately, yeah, we've kind of, managed to some, all of us, have the tendency to do this, but some men have certainly, managed to like push down this natural, feeling and inclination towards, being a father. And but I think it's when we start to look at like what you're asking about now is how they've reacted and how they res- the decision that some of them made towards abortion or pushing abortion on their girlfriend. They're just like the women that we've interviewed. It's heartbreaking because some of them, and the men and the women were similar in this way, in that both of them, we certainly found a number of men that were very regretful, and that were in some ways broken because they never experienced the healing, post-abortion
Yes.
healing and
Mhm.
that sort of thing, which, by the way, is, I think, where we're going next with our next study, is to stay with men, but to look into how to help them deal with this exact question. So it's pretty neat that you asked this kind of towards the end of this session, because that's where we're going next, because we think it's so important. We think that there's so many differences between how men need to be healed and how women need to be healed. And we focus mainly on the women so far,
Yes.
which, probably rightfully so. But there's just so many in the culture that say, well, why would men need to heal from abortion? They really are no part of it. They have no part of it. And yet the men that we've interviewed that were part of it, so many of them are regretful and broken and hurt, and but yet they don't think they don't think they should be, because the culture tells them they shouldn't be. It's like, well, just like you have there's no real reason for you to be upset. It wasn't you, and yet it was part of them, and
It
so
was his child. Mm.
I think, yeah, there is that. And then the other aspect of what you asked about is that, unfortunately, what we've seen from a previous study and this study with men, but with women in the previous study, is that there's defense mechanisms, that psychological defense mechanisms that are adopted to deal with the pain. And so the men, we'll probably look at this more in the next study, but with the women, we found there were 4 main defense mechanisms of minimization, justification, rationalization, and compartmentalization. And that they do that to deal with the pain. And so a lot of times they'll say, well, it was something that needed to be done. It was the right decision at the time. I don't know if I would do it again, but whatever, like that's the rationalization part of it, and so we did see that from men too. So it's tragic to hear that. It was like, well, yeah, I'd probably do it again, but or some of them would say, well, I don't think I would do it again, but at the time it seemed like the right decision, or some of them is just like, you know what, I don't think about it. I kind of bury it, and I just move ahead. It's not, it's not that big a deal. I just moved on, well, that's the compartmentalization and the minimization. And so, so there was a lot of that for the ones that did deal with abortion. And again, that was minority of this study, because we didn't require that they had abortions. We just required that they had dealt with an unexpected pregnancy. But some of them had, and of course, some of them wouldn't acknowledge all of the fallout that came from the abortion, that they couldn't correlate the two things, even though we know that there's a very, very his drinking or his drug abuse or his
Anger
anger issues, relationship problems, all these things. So, yeah.
Well, that's very interesting, and I want to thank you. I know we're out of time. Mary, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, I guess I wonder if our listeners wanted to get a hold of you, Jeff, or the Vitae Foundation, how would they do that?
Yeah, thank you. So our website is www.vitaefoundation.org. And so it's all together, and I'll spell it because it is difficult. It's V as in Victor, I as in Igloo, T as in Timothy, A as in Anthony, and then E as in Edward, followed by foundation. So Vitae Foundation. And then we have a dedicated research site that is vitaeresearchinstitute.org. So it's also all one word. But the easiest way, and they can get to the research even through the main site, which is vitaefoundation.org. And then we do have a pregnancy center specific site called vitaevault.org. And that's where we have free information for pregnancy centers that we've developed from the research and then tested at various centers across the country. And then we put it on this site for free that any pregnancy center can access. They just have to register their center, and then it's all free. So we're a nonprofit organization as well. And so we don't ever charge for that, but we have wonderful supporters and donors. And, we obviously welcome, people to, if they like what they hear and kind of this unique, approach to what we do. We're, like I said, we're a nonprofit as well. So we always, love, the support there, but we exist to kind of walk alongside so many other pro-life organizations, and just to do what we're doing here, to try to share, the messages and the research, and try to use the head and the heart, for to do our work in this movement. And I just really appreciate both of you for the opportunity to talk about the research and to share it. And obviously, I can talk all day about it, but I thank you for this time that you've given me.
Thank you, Jeff. This has been great and so interesting. And I can't wait for some discussion after we get off here. But if you actually, I'm just feeling I need to talk to the men. If you felt feelings about this, if you could connect to some of these symptoms or these findings that we found, if you've had an abortion in your past, there is help for you. There are abortion recovery studies for men. And if you go to operationoutcry.org, you will find some resources there for you. And we really, Mary and I always encourage every one of our listeners, if you've had an abortion in your past, even if you don't think it's ever bothered you, we encourage you to look into an abortion recovery program because I'm telling you, it's life changing. It's
Yes.
transforming. It's going to set you free from things you didn't even know you were in bondage to. That
That's
was
right.
how it was for me because we want everyone who's had that experience to know that there's forgiveness, there's healing from the shame, guilt, regret, grief, trauma, all those things. There is healing and restoration from that. And we want that for everybody. And we want to thank you again, Jeff, for coming on. It was very fascinating, such good information. I can't wait to delve more into this. And thank you, Mary. And thank you all for listening in to More to the Story with Molly White. I hope you like and share it with everyone you know. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to contact us. Thank you and God bless. Bye-bye.